And that's what we've been talking about. Thankfully, even though I forgot my shoes this morning, I'm not wearing holy socks. So, work, rest, are those for our good as well?
Absolutely.
Do we need both of those things?
Yes.
In proper measure? Because what happens if you just had surgery, and which one of those do you need more at that time?
Work.
Your body's doing a lot of work without you really having to direct it. So you've got to do more of the resting. But if you had a joint replaced or something, you're going to have to go to work immediately on getting that joint working, right? So part of this whole thing we've been talking about holiness and about holy community, is this idea of wholeness. And that it means that we have to keep things in balance. We cannot ever be whole if we're all work and no rest. We cannot be holy if we are all rest and no work. Those two things have to be kept in balance, and that is part of God's plan to bless His people. So we're going to be talking about these ideas of work and rest today, and what that means for holy community. Because every choice we make is going to have an impact on our relationships with each other, our relationship with our families, and with the world around us, including about our work and our rest. So that's where we're going today. Everybody ready?
Ready.
Give me the signal. You're ready to go.
Seatbelts on.
Okay, seatbelts on, Mickey says. Where did we start? Where does the story start about God's intention for man? Anybody know?
Genesis.
It starts at the very beginning, right? In the beginning, God created, and it goes through the different days. And then the last day where He made stuff, He made people. He made them to be the pinnacle of creation, to rule over all the rest of the world. That's what it says in Genesis chapter 1. So if you want to flip over there real quick, the first book in the Bible, Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps over the earth." So God gave this responsibility to people. This is what He intended for them. The whole world was made for their benefit. That was the purpose. And He said it was very good. And then it says at the very end of that chapter, evening and morning, the sixth day, He saw it was very good. So beginning of chapter 2, what does He do next? The seventh day, He rested. It was all complete. All the work was complete. By the seventh day, God completed all the work which He had done. He rested on the seventh day from all His work. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy because He rested from all His work which God had created and made. So this is something in the very embedded into the reality of our planet and the universe itself. Not something that people came up with later. The Jews said, we need a weekend. We better have one day off per week. This is something God put into the very nature of the world. So, that was there. But notice that, let's go on down here, where it talks about where He made man, and then verse 15. This is the first job. Lord God took man, put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. The first job. Now, were there weeds yet? Were there bugs that destroyed? No. But the garden still needed keeping. Now, what happens in the next chapter? The serpent comes along, says, "Oh, look at this over here. You probably want to eat some of this." And Eve does, and then Adam does, and God has to say, you made this choice, and these are the consequences of that choice. What was the one that came to Adam? The first one, it says in verse 17. Remember, the first job was to care for the garden. "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you. You shall eat of the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground." So the issue is not just that now the earth itself is suffering from the results of man's sin, but it's that man's work is frustrated. Woman's work is frustrated. Our very nature of what we are supposed to be creating glory with God has now been twisted. It's been darkened. A shadow has been put upon it. And so, how many of you are just delighted every Monday morning to get up and go to work? Or another day that you might have to work? Because we face frustration. Things don't go the way they're supposed to. And even if you have a job where you're doing what you love, you still have all these things that make it go like it's not supposed to go. The things that derail you. The things that interfere with it. And sometimes you've got to deal with politics and people that are doing one thing and saying another, and they don't say what they mean. And how can we function properly in a world where that is true? It's all part of the curse. It is not the wholeness that God intends for his people. So sin brings frustration to work. We can see, but there is rest still embedded into the way God wired us and the way God wired the world. Now, let's jump ahead. We're going to go to another section of the Bible in Proverbs, because Proverbs has a lot to say about work. A good bit about wisdom, because if you've got to have a proper balance between work and rest, you can err on either side, correct? You can have too much rest or you can have too much work. Well, Proverbs has to, how you like that little sign? Attention sluggards, please do not harass the ant. Do some work. There's your tip. Go away. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 6. If y'all flip there, we can just glance at these. There's more than one place in Proverbs that talks about this. Go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways, and be wise, which having no chief, officer, or ruler, prepares her food in the summer, gathers her provision in the harvest. How long will you lie down, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and your poverty will come like a vagabond, your need like an armed man. So here, the wisdom being dispensed is don't err on the side of too much rest. You've got to work hard if you want to go, and especially when the season is right. Don't wait until the very end. We could look over at chapter 13, verse 4. I've got these in order in Proverbs for us, because there's this idea here between who is it that is out, who is creating, who is joining God in the work of building. 13:4, the soul of the sluggard craves. Notice the direction, craves and gets nothing. But the soul of the diligent is made fat. They've got plenty. 21 verses 25 and 26, Proverbs 21. The desire of the sluggard puts him to death, for his hands refuse to work. All day long he is craving, while the righteous gives and does not hold back. One more in Proverbs 24, verses 30 through 34. Just one page over. Nope. 2. I passed by the field of the sluggard, and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense. Behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles, its surface covered with nettles, the stone wall broken down. When I saw, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and your poverty will come like a robber, and your want like an armed man. Not taking care of things in due time is a lack of wisdom. It's a lack of diligence. It is a lack of holiness. This proper balance between work and rest. Now you notice some of these things, this contrast between givers and takers that we saw in Proverbs. Who is it that is joining God in creativity, in productivity, in work? Because it says God is a God who works. Even Jesus, when they accused him of breaking the Sabbath, he says, my Father is working even today. So this balance that is there, and this thing about giving, taking, which side are we going to be on? Always craving or generous? Psalm 127. Just so we see this in a proper balance, because we want to not fall on either side about too much work or too much rest. Psalm 127, verse 2. This is where we really get down to what is the underlying mentality to fall over on either side, particularly on the side of too much work. It is vain for you to rise up early, to retire late, to eat the bread of painful labor, for he gives to his beloved even in his sleep. People that are working 24/7, they're just going at it tooth and nail, always nose to the grindstone. He says it's vain. You're not going to get ahead that way, because the ones God loves, he gives sleep. He gives them rest. The balance has to be there. So, next slide, we're going to go a little bit further here. When God was called out these people from being slaves in Egypt. Now, did slaves have a choice of when they worked? No. What do you think their taskmasters are going to do? They're going to drive them to get as much as possible out of them until they have just literally sucked the life out of them. That's how they've treated the slaves. But God is calling them to be a holy people. And so what is one of the big 10 that he gives them when he is giving them these instructions to say, this is how you're supposed to live. This is what I mean for people to be like. This is what a just nation looks like. One of the big 10 that he gives them is, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Again, this balance between, it have to be combined to have wholeness. So, how serious was this? I mean, was this only for the people that could vote? Was this only for the landholders? Was this only for the men? Who was included in this command to rest on the seventh day? Everyone. Even the animals were included. Animals need a day off too. And women. They weren't supposed to cook. To get the food ready so that all you had to do was get it out and eat it. Everyone needed a day off. Now, we live in this world now where we think, oh yeah, that's nice. And yes, we have some freedom so that, it's not like what they did in Numbers chapter 15. Numbers chapter 15, they hadn't had the Ten Commandments very long, and they go out and they find this guy gathering firewood on the Sabbath. And they kind of bring him in and they say, what are we going to do with this guy? And they ask God, and he says, you're going to kill him.
Wow.
Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 and following, if you want to read that story. It was serious business. Now that's not saying that we live under that same law, but the principle is still there. If we go working 30 days straight without a day off, do you think it's going to make us more of what God wants us to be? If we treat someone else that way, are we participating in God's work or the enemy's? Maybe you'll have heard BUSY. Could be an acronym for being under Satan's yoke. When you have no time to rest, to reflect, to pause and consider. So this thing about remembering the Sabbath, it was to be a constant reminder to them that God rescued them from the situation where they did not get a day off, where they were slaves and they had no choice. Because God always preserves for His people choice. He gives us the opportunity to honor Him. He gives us the opportunity to put our trust in Him. So let's do one more here, just so that we can see. Because God even gave them a Sabbath year where the land got off. The very land itself got a year off. They could farm for 6 years, and the next year they were supposed to not plant. Anything that grew wild they could pick, but they weren't supposed to do any planting to give the land a rest. Now the people didn't do it for most of the time. And so in the history of the nation, the prophets come along and they tell them again and again, and finally the prophet Jeremiah says, you're going to be in exile for 70 years. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, it tells, just like the prophet Jeremiah said, you're going to be in captivity. The land is going to be empty for 70 years, and it's finally going to get its rest. So this is very important to God, and yet He gives us a choice. He gives us this flexibility to manage it so that we are not bound by this rigid law saying, on this day of the week, you must do no work. But that He trusts us as mature people to hold to the principle. So we have to work, but we also have to rest, and we need to keep that in balance. Let's play a little game here. All right, let's see. How can we divide? Let's come from this aisle back is one team. This aisle up is another team. And this aisle up is one team, and this aisle back's a team. Y'all ready to play a game? Okay, you've got 10 seconds to choose a captain. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, you got captains chosen. All right, so in this game, you're going to be competing against each other. The 4 teams are going to be competing against each other. And if your captain raises one hand and the other teams only raise 2 hands, then the team that raised one hand will get 10,000 points. The other teams will get nothing. If every team raises 2 hands, each team will get 100 points. If there is more than one team that has just one hand and some that have no hands, then nobody gets points. Do I need to write this down? See?
What does the different hands mean?
Okay. If your team captain raises 2 hands and every other team does, then all teams get 100 points.
Just like rock, paper, scissors, is it just random? Okay. Is that what this is?
Let's go ahead and go and we'll roll with it.
If
You just want to be different than the other teams. That's how you get the most points.
you get the most points if you are the only team that is different.
Right.
Oh, okay.
You get middle points if you're different than some of the teams.
Right.
If all the teams are the same, all teams get the same points.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What can I buy with the points? Because otherwise, I don't,
All right. Well, I'll have a secret message for you.
Well, you know what? That didn't work for me.
Okay.
If you win, you get more pride. Yeah.
Okay.
Just what I need.
Everybody ready? Your team captains are ready. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Raise your hands. Okay. So, Dusty has gotten 10,000 points for their team. No one else gets any points. All right. So, 10,000.
Way to go, Kelly.
Okay, here we are. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Raise your hands. Oh. Now, 0 points for Dusty's team. The other teams get 1,000 apiece. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Oh, 10,000. 10,000 again for Dusty's team. 0 for the others. 3, 2, 1. Oh. Everybody raised one hand. Now,
Do paper.
what do y'all pick up from this? We've got 1,000 points here, 1,000 here, 1,000 here, 20,000 there. You're familiar with the ways of describing competition, the ways of describing negotiation, where one party wins and the other party loses, where one party wins and the other party wins as well, where all parties lose. What goes behind that thinking?
Fixed pie.
Fixed pie, good. So if there is a limited amount of resources, this is all there is, then the bigger piece I can get, the less there is for anyone else. And if someone else gets more, that means less for me. Win, lose. And the more people get caught up in this limited thinking, that there's only a limited amount, and they're afraid they're not going to get their part, what does it bring about? Strife. Dog eats dog. So that when you fight, what happens? Everybody loses in the end. Yet if everyone works together to support one another, does the value keep increasing for everyone? If you go back and look at any world culture that begins to embrace the creation God, the God who made the world and who continues to to sustain the world and to bless his people, those cultures are bound together with a view that the pie is not limited. Now, there's a lot of things going into any one nation, and there's more than one culture at work. But where that culture predominates, people feel secure to seek a win-win where everyone benefits from the interaction, and they're not out to defeat the others so that they can win. Think about work and rest. If you feel like there's limited resources, and you've got to make sure that you stay ahead of everyone else, what's going to push you to do? To keep working. Because if you stop and rest, what's going to happen? You're going to be left behind. How many people in our country are workaholics? They don't know how to rest. They don't know how to be still. They're driven and not called. They don't know how to maintain that balance. This idea of Sabbath rest and of wholeness, that we have this need to have this balance. So let's go through a few more things that we want to add into this pot as we think about work and rest as a holy community. Next slide. Way back in the Old Testament, when God was giving these laws to the Jews to help them really get a grasp on what is justice, what is holiness, what does it mean to live in a good way. One of the commands he gives is, they get all the grain threshed, and then they pile it up on the threshing floor, and they've got to thresh it to get the grains beat out from the things on the grass. And the way they usually did that was to take a big animal and drag the thing over it. God gives the command, don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. Now, how much grain can a cow eat? A lot. Okay? Why did God give that command? Well, maybe instead of looking in the verse in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, where God gives that command, that's one of the places where it's mentioned, we could go look in 1 Corinthians 9. Paul gives a little insight into this. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 9. Because while God is concerned about animals, Jesus said, your heavenly Father even knows when a single sparrow falls to the ground, but of how much more worth are you? So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:9, it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. God's not primarily concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking for our sake? Yes, for our sake it was written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing in the crops. What is this about? The worker is worthy of his wages. If someone is working, they need to be paid for that work. They need to receive a benefit from that work. Now, there's some other things that God mentions both in the Old Testament, and then he goes on to talk in the New Testament about it, where people that are trying to get that unfair advantage, where they're the only ones that get to win and everyone else has to lose. This last thing, here in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 13, and it's again mentioned about the labor worthy of his hire in 1 Timothy 5, verse 18. Both of these places we have this idea where God tells the people, don't even keep the wages overnight. Don't delay in paying this person who is working. because they needed that pay to buy their supper. He says, don't even take their garment and pledge overnight, because they need that garment to be their blanket at night. Those poor people. Don't take advantage. Don't hold all the power. Don't hold all the cards. Win, lose, where I've got the power, you're going to do what I say. That's not a holy way of living. So think about some of the practices that you might know about in America's corporate world today, where people's pay is delayed by significant amounts. And then they get injured on the job because of something wrong with the job, but the company works hard to try to force the blame somewhere else, and the payment of the medical bills and other things get held off forever and ever. And meanwhile, who is suffering? God is very concerned about these things. He says He is the defender of the orphans, the widows, the father to the fatherless, the defender of those who have no power for themselves, and He will avenge them. You go back in our history, and you might see some of these things even more in contrast. Mining companies that paid their wages not in legal tender, but in script. They could only use their pay at the company store, where everything cost more. So the company's gouging them from both sides. This is not God's way. Now, we've kind of laid all these pieces out, and if you just left that piece, you're going to fall out of balance again. You're going to think, oh, we need to go all do Occupy Wall Street. But what else does God say? Let's go on to 2 Thessalonians. And the next slide, please. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Paul is telling about these people that there's a group of them in the church in Thessalonica that they've got the idea that, oh, Jesus is coming back. Well, we don't have to do any work then, because, we can just live on what we've got. And if we run out, well, someone else can help out, because God said to be generous, right? This give versus take mentality. Let's read there, 2 Thessalonians 3. Paul's telling about the example that they set, because Paul was quite a worker. I mean, even though he's doing all this to share the gospel, where he went, he often ended up doing a day job so that he was earning his own keep. 2 Thessalonians 3, beginning in verse 7. You yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We did not act in an undisciplined manner among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with labor and hardship we kept working night and day so we wouldn't be a burden to any of you. Not because we don't have the right to be supported by them. That's what he was talking about in 1 Corinthians 9. We have the right to be supported by those who benefit from our work. But in order to offer ourselves as a model to you, that you might follow our example, for even when we were with you, we used to give you this order: if anyone will not work, neither let him eat. That doesn't go over very well in our American culture today, does it? We hear some among you are leading an undisciplined life, doing no work at all, but acting as busybodies. Such persons we command and exhort in the Lord Jesus to work in quiet fashion, eat their own bread. There's more than one place where he talks about that. The one who stole should no longer steal, but let him work with his hands so he will have to give. This balance between work and rest is all about forming us into God's character so that we will be like Him. Is God a God who constantly demands from us, or is He a God who constantly gives?
Gives.
Now, the mother who loves her baby, she is constantly giving to that baby. But if she doesn't maintain the proper balance between work and rest, is she going to be able to continue that? No. The way she can love that baby is to make sure that she rests. I could have brought you all several references about scientific studies where they've done with people that were just work, and they never rested, and how over time the productivity just continued to drop. And those that had too much rest, also their productivity continued to drop. But those that maintain a balance, somewhere around 1 day in 7, had maximum productivity. I could tell you this story about the Pilgrims. When they first came, they had all these high ideals about really sharing in the community, everyone together. And so they had a community garden. And it was everybody's job to take care of this community garden, and then we would distribute the food from it evenly. Well, guess what? The first year, everyone said, oh, well, I've got to go work on this, so someone else can work in the garden today. And they ended up with a rather poor harvest because since it was everybody's job, it was nobody's job. The next year, they quickly changed it so that each family had their section that they were responsible to keep up. Now, they still shared. They were generous from that. But no one got a free ride. God wants us to be whole. He wants us to be in His character, that we are constantly in the process of creating, of giving, of making a better, more, and not on the side of what's in it for me and take, and if I don't get my share, then I'm going to make sure someone else suffers. Work and rest. We've got just a few more minutes. How does this meet the road? How does the rubber meet the road for us? I can't lay down any laws. I can't tell you, if you do this, rah. That's not something God has put on any man. But we can ask each other questions. We can relate to each other as God's mature people so that we are constantly examining the choices that we make. Are they contributing to a world where God's holy character is in evidence? Where we are treating our fellow man with dignity and with justice? So here's a few questions. What happens when we leave the day when most people have to worship, when we leave that as the only day where we do all of our shopping? Who's going to man the store? What does that mean for them? Or the restaurant? What does that mean for them? Somebody has to have that job. Are we going to only have people that don't worship on Sunday to have those jobs? Well, what if they become a Christian and they want to worship on Sunday? I know Sunday is the most popular day for restaurants. And with us commuting back and forth to Caldwell for these last few weeks, H-E-B or Walmart's a lot cheaper place to shop for groceries than it is at Brookshire's in Caldwell. So we've been shopping it on Sunday afternoon before we go back. Is our behavior contributing to a world where people can have the day of rest? Or what about our own individual work-life balance? The time that we're taking off from work, the time that we take for vacation, what is it that we do during our vacation time? Is that just time that we're going to catch up on all the other work that we haven't been able to do because of our job? How do we maintain a proper work-life balance so that we are whole? Just like that mother with the baby needs to nap when the baby naps, with the newborn baby. If she's going to maintain the best, how are we going to do that? I had an interview this last week, a company that every person that I talked to as I penetrated further in up to the hiring manager, they kept increasing the amount of time they expected of travel. Until the final person I talked to, and I just thought, and I told her, well, I do have a family that I want to remain involved in their lives. And it'd be kind of hard to do that just for 7 days out of a month.
Wow.
How do we foster justice for the lowest tier of workers, those who have the least choice? Those that... Okay, so in America we don't have slavery, but we have people that have slaves' lives. Because they don't have a choice. They've got to take that job that they have to work 7 days a week, all kind of hours where they don't have any time off. And they're not really paid for the work that they're doing. Because someone higher up has decided that it'd be better for them to get 10,000 points even if the others really get very few. How do we foster a world where it's more fair? We'll never get there, but how do we move towards it? How do we continue to encourage the right things? These are questions we have to ask ourselves as God's holy people. How will we relate to those who circumstance and their own choices have pulled them further away from what God means for whole people? How do we become involved in the restoration of what God means for us to be? Those are the questions. Do you all remember the story of Ruth in the Bible? A woman named Naomi, her husband and 2 sons end up leaving the land of Israel. They lived near Bethlehem, and there was a famine, no food. So they, just like many people in history, moved to find a better opportunity. And the place they went was the country of Moab. And they lived there for a while. They found some wives for their sons. But over time, both the father and the 2 sons died. 3 widows left, the mother and her 2 daughters-in-law. And she's there, no way of supporting herself. Decides she'll go back to where her family is, back in the land of Israel. And her 2 daughters-in-law are going to come with her. And she says, oh no, stay here with your own families. I don't have anything for you. And so one of them does, but Ruth refuses. She says, no, I will go with you wherever you go. And where you die, that's where I'm going to be buried. So she goes back with Naomi. And they get to Bethlehem. Now, they were widows. They couldn't have their own trade or anything like that. How are they going to support themselves? Well, just like we talked about last week, God commanded the people, when you harvest, leave some for the poor people to gather. And so Ruth goes out to gather some of the leftovers in the field. what was supposed to be left around the edges, and then if they dropped any while they were carrying it, that was not to be picked up. Don't try to scrap for every little bit to get ahead. And so Ruth goes out, and she happens upon the field of a holy man, a righteous man, Boaz. And he sees that she is working hard, and he's heard the story about how she came back with her mother-in-law, even though her mother-in-law had nothing to offer her, just for loyalty, just for love. And here she is working in the field to pick up scraps so they'll have something to eat. And so he tells his workers, why don't you pull out a little bit more and drop it while you go? And then they run into this other thing that was part of God's command for this forming a more just community, so that these widows weren't left without any hope, that the nearest kinsman was supposed to take them on as a wife, if they could. And so Naomi kind of gives Ruth the sly stuff and says, he's going to be threshing tonight and falling asleep, so you need to kind of go, and here's how it works to give him the signal, you need to take me as a wife. And Boaz, they go through it and behave with honor, and Boaz says, well, I'm not the closest one, but I'm not going to rest today until I talk to the one who has first right. And he goes and works it out. That man says, no, I can't. It would mess up my own inheritance. You take her. And Boaz marries Ruth. And she becomes King David's great-grandmother in the line of Christ. A foreigner who just came and had no opportunity except that God had created by his laws a way for these people who were down at the bottom of the social ladder, who had no other opportunity, so that righteous people made a way for them to live, to climb, to improve, to grow. Will we be Boaz? Will we make opportunities for others by the way that we relate to them? I know I've asked more questions than I've given answers. I'm not the answer guy. Only God is. Let's take this opportunity to really seek God's will and what He is calling each of us to do in the opportunities that we have to be His holy people, His representatives in this world.